All right, so now that we've discussed some of the specific TypeScript syntax for things like variables, functions, and arrays, let's actually take a look at the main types that TypeScript provides us with to build our programs. Now, the first thing to note is that TypeScript contains all of the same types as basic Java programs contain, but it also has a few extra types that are used for certain situations. So what we're going to do here is I'm just going to clean all of this stuff out of our app.ts file, and we'll start fresh and just do a few demonstrations with the different types that TypeScript provides. So first of all, let's just go through the basic types that TypeScript shares with JavaScript. The first two, which we've already learned about, are the number type. So that would look something like this. We could say let x number equals, and then we could say, I don't know, 10, something like that. And it's worth noting too that in TypeScript, just like in JavaScript, numbers can either be integer numbers or they can be floating point decimals. So, we could say something like let pi number equals 3.1415, whatever. And that would be a number as well, right? So there's not a specific float or double type like there are in other languages such as Java or C++. So anyway, that's how numbers work in TypeScript. And we've also seen the string type, and just for good measure, I'll add an example here. We'll just say let, and we'll say something like greeting again, string equals, and then just like in JavaScript, you can either use single quotes, double quotes, backticks if you want to, in order to define a string. And strings can also be empty too, by the way. So if you were to just have an opening quote and a closing quote, that would count as a string as well, okay? So that's numbers and strings. And additionally, we also have the same basic types as JavaScript does, such as Booleans, right? So you could say something like let is connected, right? Something like that. You might have in a program to keep track of whether a connection has been established. And then you could say colon Boolean, and just like in JavaScript, the only two values that a Boolean can contain are true and false. So besides numbers, strings, and Booleans, TypeScript also provides an object type specifically for when we want to assign an object to a variable. Now this one actually is a little bit tricky because while it's perfectly possible to say something like let person and then say colon object, and then that allows us to just define a basic object just like we would in JavaScript. So we could say something like name, Sean, hair color, brown, right? While it's perfectly fine to do this, usually what we're going to want to do in TypeScript is actually define the specific properties that an object has so that we know what type of data we're working with. And this is something that we'll look at in much more detail a little bit later on when we see how to define things like custom types as well as classes in TypeScript. But for now, just know that it's possible to use object as a type for a variable, but there's usually a better way to go about it, right? Object tends to just be a lazy type that developers use when they don't feel like getting specific with what properties an object contains. All right, so that's how the object type works in TypeScript. The next thing that I want to show you is we've already talked about how arrays work in TypeScript, but there's actually an alternative syntax for declaring a variable as an array type, and that looks like this. We might say something like let, and if we wanted to make an array of numbers, let's say, we could say let numbers, and then for the type, we could actually say capital A array. And then in triangle braces, this looks a little bit funny. This is something that we'll discuss in much more detail later on, called a generic type. We could just put the type of data that that array is going to contain. So now we could say, 1, 2, 3, and just define our array in the usual way. So this is the alternative syntax for defining an array. And really, this is pretty much exactly the same thing as just saying let numbers and then saying number with square brackets after it, right? This is in fact a sort of syntactic sugar for this slightly more complicated syntax for declaring arrays. But again, this syntax with the triangle braces is something that we'll talk about in much more detail later when we talk about generic types. All right, so we've talked about numbers, strings, booleans, objects, and the alternative syntax for arrays. There are certain situations in TypeScript programs where we want to create an array that specifically has different data types for each element in the array. And I'm not talking about arrays that can just contain whatever data we want, but there are certain situations where we want, let's say, the first element in an array to be a string, the second element to be a number, and let's say the third element to be a Boolean. Well, in that case, TypeScript provides us with something called a tuple, and it's probably just easiest if I show you what that looks like. So let's say again that we wanted to store, let's say, a person's data in an array instead of in an object, right? So instead of having name, hair color, and maybe age as properties in an object, we wanted them to specifically be stored as individual elements in an array. Well, what that might look like is we could say let person, and I'll just call this person tuple so that we remember what data type this is. And then after that, the way that we define a tuple is by using square brackets and adding the different data types that we want at each point in the array inside these square brackets. So again, if we wanted the first element of this tuple to be a string, we would just say string. And then if we wanted the second element to be a number, we could say number. And then if we wanted the third element to be a Boolean, we could just say Boolean. And now the way that we would assign a value to this tuple would be by creating an array whose types match these types that we added here, right? So we could say something like Bob if we want this to be the person's name. We could say 40 if we want this to be the person's age, and then we could say true if we want to indicate whether this person likes coffee or something like that. Okay, so that's what a tuple would look like, and notice that the purpose of a tuple is really quite a bit different from the purpose of an array. Generally, in JavaScript, there's not really a distinction, but in an array, we're usually just trying to store different pieces of data that aren't necessarily related to the same object. Whereas with tuples, tuples are usually just a slightly different way of storing. All right, so now that we've covered all of the basic types that TypeScript shares with JavaScript, as well as this tuple type, which, well, not truly unique to TypeScript. TypeScript is unique in actually providing a separate name for this situation. Let's talk about a few of the other types that TypeScript provides. Now, one that we've already seen several times is the any type. And the any type is a type that we can give to our variables when we specifically want that variable to be able to hold different types of values over its lifetime. So, all right, so let's say that we want to define a variable called something, all right? And we want this something variable to be able to contain numbers, strings, etc. over the course of its lifetime. Well, all we would have to do in that situation is assign the any type to this variable. And now we could add a string to it, right? We could say hello, and then later on we could say something equals 42, and then we could say something equals true. And as you can see, TypeScript isn't complaining about this because we've specifically said it's all right, you can ignore this variable. Now, before you get too attached to the any type, I do just want to warn you that more often than not, the any type is used by developers as a way to avoid static typing in general, right? Too often it's used by developers who came from JavaScript and are just starting to learn TypeScript and can't quite get some situation to work, so they just put any on all the variables, and well, that gets TypeScript to stop complaining, but it also gets rid of all of the benefits of using TypeScript in the first place. All right, so I would highly recommend that you use caution when using the any type, and there are certain situations where the any type can be useful. All right, so for example, in situations where you want to have an array of different types of data and you don't really know what order that data is going to be in, etc., that would be a situation where you could use the any type and not have it be quite as harmful. All right, so if we were to say something like let data and give this the type of any array, what that would allow us to do then is put strings into that array, put numbers into that array, put booleans into the array. We could even put other arrays into that array if we wanted to. And in this case, TypeScript wouldn't complain, right? And that actually brings up another good point, and that is that the any type is really only used in situations where there's not a good way to represent the types. So for example, when you get into more complex topics such as functional programming with TypeScript, occasionally you will have to use the any type just because you might have a function that returns a function that returns a function, etc. And the typing for that would just be way too complex. But really, those situations are very few and far between in most people's cases. So my advice would just be to avoid the any type if at all possible. And in case you're wondering about this situation here with the any array, there actually would be a better way to do this. So if you know that you want an array that can contain either strings, numbers, or booleans in any order, then a better way to do that would be to use something called a union type. And that's something that we'll talk about in more detail later, so for now, don't worry about it. But anyway, now that we've seen the any type, the last types that I want to mention are null and undefined. These ones are really pretty boring in TypeScript because they only have one main value that they can contain. So if we were to say something like let nothing and then give this the type of undefined, really that can only contain undefined, all right? And same thing with null. We could say something like let another nothing, and we could give that the type of null, and that would just contain the value null. All right, now if this seems a little bit strange that you would have a variable with the specific type of undefined or the specific type of null, it usually is, right? These types are usually used as part of union types, which I just mentioned, in order to allow variables to be either a string or undefined, for example. And that's something that we'll take a look at, as I said, a little bit later. All right, so these are pretty much all of the main types in TypeScript. One more type that I wanted to mention, again, is the never type. This is something that we saw earlier. The never type is really not a type that's ever used to represent data. It's usually just used to notify developers that they've done something wrong, right? So as we saw earlier, if we create an array of some sort, right? So if we say let my array equals, and we just assign an empty array to it, well, TypeScript is going to give this array the type of never array because it wasn't able to infer what type of data this array was supposed to contain, right? So in other words, this is really just telling the developer that they need to say something like string array if they want this array to contain strings. You'll see this never type pop up in some other situations, but I just wanted to make you aware of the purpose of the never type. All right, so anyway, now that we've covered all of the basic types in TypeScript, the next thing that we're going to talk about is the tsconfig file in TypeScript projects.